Daniel and Tyler Mercer never imagined their lives would spiral into a nightmare, but one night in Oakridge, a father's trust in the police and a teen's desperate fear collided in a violent chain of events that would shock a town and expose a deadly abuse of power. Daniel Mercer lived in Oakridge, a town that prided itself on quiet streets and tight-knit neighbors. At 42, he was known as a reliable mechanic, the kind of man who always showed up early to work and rarely made waves. He had once been married, but his wife had died suddenly 3 years ago, leaving Daniel to raise their only son, Tyler, alone. Tyler, 16, had been a cheerful child, full of energy and curiosity, but after his mother's death, he became withdrawn and rebellious. Friends and neighbors noticed the change. He started skipping school, spending late nights wandering the streets, and getting into arguments with his father more frequently. Daniel tried to be patient, to guide him gently, but each day the tension in their small home grew heavier. One Friday evening, the situation reached a breaking point. Neighbors reported hearing loud crashing sounds, shouting, and what sounded like something breaking in the Mercer house. When the police arrived, they found Tyler sitting on the porch, tense and angry, while Daniel stood nearby, exhausted and disoriented. Instead of offering support or mediation, the officers seemed unusually engaged in the conflict. Sergeant Cole, a veteran officer with a reputation for unconventional tactics, told Daniel that Tyler needed to be taught a lesson, hinting that strict discipline was the only way to handle the boy. Exhausted and unsure of what to do, Daniel left the police words to linger in his mind, believing he had no other option to regain control of his household. From that night on, Daniel's life changed dramatically. Police visits became regular, each one framed as guidance but increasingly manipulative. Officers painted Tyler as a dangerous threat, someone who might lash out at any moment, even against his own father. Daniel, desperate for control and influenced by those in authority, began to act on their suggestions. Small disagreements escalated into punishments far harsher than he had ever imagined. He locked doors, monitored Tyler constantly, and followed every recommendation the officers made, believing that obedience to law enforcement equaled safety. As weeks passed, Daniel's mental state deteriorated. The line between discipline and abuse blurred under the officers' influence. Tyler, frightened and confused, became more withdrawn and defiant. Friends and neighbors noticed bruises and signs of fear, but every time they raised concerns, the police dismissed them, portraying the situation as typical teenage rebellion. The Mercer home, once a place of routine and quiet, became a cage of fear and manipulation. What had started as a grieving father struggling with a rebellious teen was evolving into a perilous situation fueled by those sworn to protect, setting the stage for a tragedy that would shake Oakridge to its core. As the weeks went by, Daniel's home became a place of constant tension. The police visits, initially sporadic, grew more frequent and intrusive. Officers would arrive unannounced, inspecting the house, asking questions, and leaving behind a lingering sense of judgment. Each time they came, they painted Tyler as increasingly dangerous, exaggerating minor arguments into threats that required firm action. Daniel, exhausted and overwhelmed, began to internalize their warnings. The officers insisted that Tyler could strike at any moment, that a father had to show authority without hesitation, and that hesitation could cost him dearly. Over time, Daniel's own sense of reality shifted. He started to see his son not as a grieving teenager but as a potential aggressor waiting to attack. Tyler, on the other hand, was becoming more isolated and fearful. Friends noticed his sudden withdrawal from social activities and the new bruises on his arms and torso. Teachers tried to intervene, but every time they reported their concerns, the police responded in a way that protected themselves rather than the boy. Reports were filed that painted Tyler as confrontational and rebellious, reinforcing the narrative that Daniel repeated in the house. The constant surveillance and warnings created an environment where every interaction between father and son was strained, filled with tension, suspicion, and fear. One night, after an argument over Tyler's curfew, Daniel, in a haze of exhaustion and fear, struck his son with a belt. The officers, who had been watching from outside under the pretext of safety checks, did not intervene. Instead, they gave subtle signs of approval, as though they were guiding Daniel's actions rather than preventing harm. The act left Tyler bruised and terrified, but it also emboldened the officers to continue their manipulative tactics. They framed the incident as a test of control, telling Daniel that he had acted correctly and that his son needed these lessons to learn respect. As Daniel followed their instructions, he began drinking more heavily to cope with the stress and fear of failing to maintain control. The house, once a home filled with ordinary frustrations and teenage rebellion, had become a trap of escalating violence and psychological manipulation. The officer's influence over Daniel had grown stronger than any law or moral code, and Tyler's world shrank to the small, tense space of his home. Neighbors whispered about what they heard, the sounds of arguments, shouts, and occasional crashes. No one could imagine that the people who should have protected them were deliberately stoking the fire, pushing a grieving father and a terrified son toward a collision that neither would survive unscathed. The tension in the Mercer household reached a breaking point on a stormy night in April. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind rattled the doors, creating a sense of chaos that mirrored the emotions inside the house. Tyler had been arguing with his father all evening, frustrated by the constant restrictions and punishments. Daniel, already on edge from weeks of police warnings and manipulation, snapped. The argument escalated quickly, with voices rising and tempers flaring. Every word seemed to push them closer to a point of no return. A neighbor, hearing the shouting and seeing Tyler run out into the pouring rain, called the police. Within minutes, multiple patrol cars arrived, lights flashing and sirens muted to avoid alarming the rest of the neighborhood. Officers swarmed the property, presenting themselves as responders to a violent disturbance. But what unfolded next was far from a standard intervention. They pushed past Daniel into the house and immediately focused on Tyler, portraying him as the aggressor and insisting he needed to be restrained. In the chaos, Daniel, still overwhelmed and frightened, struck Tyler again. What happened next would later be described as a violent takedown in official reports, but witnesses saw a far different story. Police body cam footage, later leaked, revealed officers shouting at Daniel to finish what you started, encouraging violence instead of preventing it. Tyler, confused, terrified, and soaked from the rain, struggled against the restraints, trying to escape the hands that held him down. Daniel attempted to intervene, realizing too late that the officers were no longer merely observers, they were active participants in the escalation. Paramedics arrived minutes later, called after Tyler was unresponsive, and the officers quickly shifted the narrative, framing the teen as having attacked his father and resisting arrest. The situation had become a nightmare of manipulation and misrepresented facts. Tyler was rushed to the hospital, where he was declared in critical condition. Daniel, still drenched and shaking, was arrested immediately, charged with aggravated assault. The officers who had encouraged his actions claimed their intervention had been necessary, their reports carefully constructed to absolve themselves of wrongdoing. The community was in shock. Neighbors who had witnessed the events firsthand struggled to reconcile the official story with what they had seen. Friends and teachers who knew Tyler described a frightened, confused boy, not a violent aggressor. As media outlets reported the incident, the narrative was dominated by police statements and official reports, leaving many unanswered questions. The storm outside mirrored the storm of fear, manipulation, and corruption inside the Mercer home, setting the stage for revelations that would later expose a pattern of abuse far beyond a single-family tragedy. In the weeks following the takedown, the town of Oakridge was consumed by a mixture of shock, grief, and confusion. Tyler's hospitalization had left the community stunned, and Daniel Mercer sat in a jail cell, consumed by guilt and despair. Official reports blamed him entirely for the incident, portraying him as an unstable father who had lost control. The police department reinforced this narrative, presenting edited footage that showed only fragments of the night's events. In these clips, Tyler appeared aggressive, Daniel defensive, and the officers' involvement nearly invisible. The public accepted the story at face value, unaware that a deeper truth was being concealed. Behind closed doors, an internal struggle was unfolding within the police department. A rookie officer who had witnessed the escalation firsthand began to question the actions of her superiors. She had seen Sergeant Cole and the other officers encourage Daniel to strike Tyler, witnessed them manipulate him into believing his son was a threat, and watched them actively participate in the violent takedown. Fearful for her career, But driven by conscience, she began collecting evidence: body cam footage, internal memos, and eyewitness statements that suggested the department had a history of promoting aggressive interventions in domestic cases to justify arrests and training exercises. As the rookie's evidence slowly made its way into investigative hands, journalists and independent watchdogs began to scrutinize the department's practices. Reports emerged that multiple officers had been accused of excessive force, intimidation, and manipulation in family disputes, yet disciplinary action had been minimal or non-existent. Families came forward with similar stories: parents coerced into punishing their children, teenagers portrayed as violent threats, and officers actively escalating domestic conflicts. Tyler Mercer's case was no longer seen as an isolated tragedy. It became emblematic of systemic abuse and corruption within the Oakridge Police Department. Daniel, confined in his cell, struggled to process the unfolding revelations. He was still haunted by the night of the takedown, replaying every detail and wondering if he could have done anything differently. But as evidence emerged, showing how the officers had manipulated him, the reality became clear. He had been both a victim and a participant, ensnared by the authority he had trusted. The town began to question not just the actions of Daniel Mercer, but the very institution meant to protect its citizens. The initial outrage over Tyler's hospitalization transformed into a broader investigation, shining a light on the dangerous power dynamics that had allowed tragedy to unfold in a family home while the rest of Oakridge remained unaware. Months passed, and the aftermath of Tyler Mercer's death continued to ripple through Oakridge. Daniel Mercer remained in prison, tormented by grief and guilt, haunted by the memory of the stormy night when everything went wrong. His life, once defined by routine and work, had been shattered completely. Friends and neighbors avoided him, some blaming him for the tragedy, others sympathizing quietly, unable to reconcile the image of a grieving father with the horrifying events that had unfolded. Despite his incarceration, Daniel's story began to reach a wider audience through investigative journalists, online documentaries, and podcasts dedicated to exposing systemic abuses of power. The rookie officer who had leaked the evidence became a pivotal figure in the unfolding investigation. Her courage in coming forward prompted state authorities to review the Oakridge Police Department's practices, and the public learned of a pattern of misconduct that stretched back years. Sergeant Cole, the officer who had pushed Daniel to discipline Tyler, was forced to resign amid mounting pressure. Several other officers faced suspension, internal investigations, and public scrutiny. The revelations shocked the town, revealing a level of manipulation and corruption that no one had imagined. Families who had experienced similar abuse began speaking out, connecting their experiences to Tyler's tragic fate and exposing the systemic failures that had allowed it to happen. Daniel, isolated in his cell, struggled to process these developments. He recognized that the officers' manipulations had driven him to acts he never would have committed on his own. Yet the consequences of those actions were irreversible. Tyler's absence was a constant, unbearable presence, and Daniel often found himself replaying the warnings, the encouragement, and the threats that had led to the fatal night. The knowledge that the very people meant to protect him and his son had orchestrated the events left him with a deep sense of betrayal, anger, and helplessness. Outside, the town began to reckon with its collective complacency. A small memorial was erected near the Mercer home, where residents left flowers, notes, and silent tributes. The tragedy sparked conversations about the abuse of authority, the vulnerability of families under pressure, and the need for accountability in law enforcement. Tyler's story became a symbol not only of the dangers of manipulation and unchecked power but also of the fragility of trust in those sworn to protect. Years later, the question that haunted Oakridge remained unanswered: who was truly responsible for Tyler's death? The community understood that while Daniel had acted violently, he had been guided, manipulated, and coerced by those in positions of power. Tyler Mercer's death served as a stark reminder that trust, when placed in the wrong hands, can be weaponized, and that the line between protector and predator is far thinner than most people ever realize. The tragedy left a permanent mark on Oakridge, a town forced to confront the consequences of fear, authority, and the human cost of manipulation.